My dad chose his toxic wife over me and my son, so I made them regret it forever. Hello, read it. There are moments in life when you realize that everything you thought was solid was nothing more than an illusion. That realization usually comes too late, after years have already been wasted. Mine came when I was 36 years old, standing in the middle of my father's house, staring at a woman who had made my life hell for 2 decades. I had spent years telling myself that it would get better, that my father would eventually stand up for me, that she would finally see me as more than just an inconvenience in her perfect little world. But none of that happened. And as I watched my son shrink back in fear, his small hands clutching his mother's dress, I knew there was no coming back from this. There are a lot of ways to lose a parent. Death is the most obvious, the most concrete. But sometimes you lose them while they're still alive. Sometimes they become strangers while they're still standing right in front of you. That's what happened to me. My name is Alex, and this story isn't about a single moment of betrayal. It's about a lifetime of them. It's about how I learned, too late, that some people will never change, no matter how much you hope they will. And it's about the final straw that broke me. The moment I realized that if I didn't walk away, my own son would suffer the same way I had. But before I get to that, I need to start at the beginning. Because no one wakes up one day and decides to cut off a parent without reason. No, this was years in the making. I was 15 when my father married Jennifer. She arrived in our lives like a thunderstorm. Loud, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. She was beautiful, charismatic, and had a way of making people fall in line without even realizing they were doing it. My father fell for her almost instantly. On the other hand, saw something else. It didn't take long for me to understand that Jennifer didn't see me as my father's son. She saw me as an obstacle. At first, the changes were subtle. She would accidentally forget to set a place for me at dinner, or tell me she thought my clothes looked sloppy when I was on my way out the door. I tried to brush it off. My mother had died when I was little, and my father had been alone for a long time. I wanted to believe that Jennifer just didn't know how to be a stepmother. But that wasn't it. She didn't want to be my stepmother. She wanted me out of the way. She started by taking control of everything in the house. Suddenly, my room wasn't mine anymore. It was subject to her scrutiny. My posters were too childish. My books were too dark. My presence in my father's life was too much. She started suggesting that I spend more time at friends' houses, that I should get a job after school, that I should be more independent. And my father? He let it happen. I think that was the worst part. If he had fought for me, if he had pushed back, maybe things would have been different. But he didn't. Instead, he nodded along, agreeing with her, telling me that Jennifer was just trying to help. By the time I graduated high school, I barely felt like I lived in that house anymore. It was like I had been phased out, turned into a ghost in my own home. When I turned 18, I left for college and barely looked back. I visited on holidays, kept my distance, and told myself that it didn't matter. But no matter how much I tried to move on, there was always this little part of me that wanted my father to see what she was doing, to wake up and realize what he had allowed. He never did. Even as I built my own life, even as I fell in love with Rachel and started a family of my own, there was always this lingering presence in the background. Jennifer's shadow, her influence. My father would call sometimes, but our conversations were always shallow, forced. Every time I saw him, he felt a little less like my father and a little more like her husband. For years, I told myself that as long as I kept my distance, as long as I maintained some boundaries, it would be okay. I could have a surface-level relationship with my father while keeping Jennifer at arm's length. And then Noah was born. Becoming a father changed everything. Holding my son for the first time, I felt something break open inside me. I finally understood what it meant to love someone unconditionally, to want to protect them from the world. And with that realization came another, darker one. My father had never done that for me. For a while I thought maybe things could be different. That maybe, as a grandfather, my father would step up in a way he never had before. But it didn't take long for me to see that Jennifer still controlled everything. When we visited, she acted like Noah was an afterthought, like he was just another burden I had brought into her perfect life. She barely acknowledged him, made snide comments about how we were raising him. And my father? He just stood there, silent as always. So we stopped visiting. I thought that would be the end of it, that I could finally close the book on that part of my life. But then came the wedding. Jennifer's daughter, my stepsister, was getting married, and my father insisted that we come. I had no real relationship with her, no reason to be there, but my father begged. He made promises, assured me that it would be a family event, that Jennifer would behave, that it would be good for Noah to see his grandfather. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I wish I hadn't. From the moment we arrived, it was clear that we didn't belong. Jennifer made sure of that. She barely spoke to us, made sure we were seated as far away from the family as possible, and when Noah tried to talk to her, she dismissed him outright. But the worst part came later. At the reception, Noah, being the sweet, innocent kid he was, wanted to be part of the celebration. He tried to dance, to join the other kids, to enjoy himself. And that's when Jennifer did something I will never forgive. She didn't just ignore him, she humiliated him. In front of everyone. I saw the look on his face, the way his little shoulders tensed, the way his excitement turned into confusion, then hurt. And in that moment, I saw myself. I saw the 15-year-old boy who had spent years trying to earn her approval, the boy who had waited for his father to step in and protect him. And I knew. I had let this happen. I had let Jennifer remain in my life. I had let my father's weakness continue to affect me. I had ignored the red flags, made excuses, believed that things would somehow change. But they never would. I should have left then and there. I should have walked out and never looked back. But I didn't. Not yet. Because I still didn't know just how much worse things were about to get. There's a strange moment of clarity that comes right before severing ties with someone forever. It's not rage, not even sadness. It's a kind of quiet acceptance, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing there's no going back. That moment came for me at the wedding, when I watched my son shrink away in confusion and hurt, his small hands still clutching the gift he had made with so much excitement. The wedding had already felt like a mistake from the moment we arrived. There was no warmth, no welcome. Jennifer had acknowledged our presence with nothing more than a glance, as though we were guests at a party we had no right to attend. My father, who had been so insistent on our presence, had barely spoken to us, choosing instead to float between conversations, acting as if nothing was wrong. But something was wrong. The weight of years of dismissal and cruelty lingered in the air, pressing down on me like an old, familiar burden. Every interaction carried the same undertones that had colored my childhood. The feeling of being tolerated rather than wanted, of being an afterthought in my own family. But it wasn't just me anymore. Now Jennifer had turned her focus onto my son. Noah had never known what it meant to be unwanted. His world had always been filled with love, encouragement, and the unwavering presence of parents who adored him. He had never questioned his worth. And yet, in that moment, standing in the middle of the reception hall with his small shoulders tensed, he understood something was wrong. The innocent excitement in his eyes had flickered into something else, something I recognized too well. He had approached Jennifer's table with nothing but kindness, holding out the tiny wrapped gift he had spent all morning preparing. It wasn't much, just a simple drawing he had made for the bride, an offering from a child who wanted to be part of the celebration. He had smiled, waiting for recognition, for some small gesture of gratitude. Jennifer didn't even look at him. Without a word, she dismissed him, waving him away as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. She continued her conversation, uninterested, unmoved. Noah stood there, his hands still outstretched, waiting for something that would never come. A second passed, then another. The realization settled over him slowly, confusion giving way to something deeper. His fingers curled around the gift, pulling it close to his chest, and without another word, he turned and walked away. Rachel was already moving before I could. She reached Noah first, kneeling beside him, whispering something in his ear, her hands brushing gently over his back. He buried his face in her shoulder, his tiny frame trembling in a way that made something inside me snap. Everything I had spent years trying to suppress, the anger, the resentment, the weight of every moment Jennifer had made me feel like I didn't belong, came rushing to the surface all at once. But this time it wasn't about me. It was about him. I had told myself for years that keeping the peace was the right thing to do. I had allowed my father's silence to excuse Jennifer's behavior. I had convinced myself that keeping some connection, no matter how fragile, was better than nothing. But standing there, watching my son hold back tears, I saw the truth. Keeping the peace had never protected me. It had only ensured that Jennifer always won. And now, by allowing her to remain in my life, I had allowed her to hurt my child. The realization came with a strange kind of calm. There was no more doubt, no more hesitation. This wasn't something I could fix. There would be no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Jennifer had never cared about the damage she inflicted. And my father, who had once again watched it all unfold in silence, would never hold her accountable. It had always been this way. Even when I was a teenager, when I had first started to see Jennifer for what she truly was, my father had refused to acknowledge it. He had dismissed my concerns, told me I was overreacting, that I needed to try harder. When she had belittled me, when she had made it clear that I was nothing more than an inconvenience, he had chosen not to see it. And now, he was doing the same thing to my son. The cycle was repeating itself right in front of me. And this time, I wasn't a helpless child. Without a word, I turned and started gathering our things. Rachel didn't ask questions. She understood. She had seen enough over the years, had stood by me as I struggled with the complicated, tangled emotions that came with a father who had abandoned me in every way that mattered. She took Noah's hand and held him close as we made our way toward the exit. Jennifer didn't stop us. She didn't call out, didn't ask why we were leaving. She didn't care. But my father followed. He was calling my name before we even reached the door, his voice carrying the same desperation I had heard so many times before. The same pleas, the same empty attempts to keep me tethered to a family that had never truly included me. He wanted to smooth it over, to pretend that nothing had happened, that Jennifer hadn't just humiliated his grandson in front of an entire room of people. For so many years, I had allowed him to do exactly that. I had accepted his apologies without change, had let myself believe that maybe, one day, he would finally see things for what they were. But that hope was gone now. Looking at him, standing there with his hands outstretched, asking me to just move past it, I felt nothing but exhaustion. There was nothing left to salvage. I had spent most of my life waiting for my father to choose me, but he never had. He had chosen her over and over again. And now, he had chosen to stand by while my son was treated the same way I had been. There was no coming back from this. As we stepped outside, I felt the weight of it settling over me. This was the moment I had spent years avoiding. The moment when I finally admitted to myself that my father wasn't the man I had wanted him to be. That he never had been. Rachel tightened her grip on my hand, grounding me, reminding me that I had already built something better. I had created a family that valued love, that protected each other, that didn't make excuses for cruelty. I had broken the cycle, and I wouldn't let my father pull me back into it. Walking away was easier than I had expected. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. Jennifer wasn't finished yet. Walking away should have been the end of it. I had spent decades tolerating Jennifer's cruelty and my father's enabling, convincing myself that maintaining some form of contact was necessary. But as I left the wedding that night, as I held my son's small hand in mine and felt his quiet sadness pressing into me like an unbearable weight, I knew there was no turning back. I had spent years trying to fix something that had never been whole to begin with. And now, for the first time, I was truly done. But Jennifer wasn't. The first sign that this wasn't over came the very next morning. My phone buzzed incessantly, messages from my father flooding my inbox. He wanted to talk, to explain, to smooth things over the way he always did. He wrote about family, about how he didn't want to lose me, about how he wished I could understand that Jennifer's behavior wasn't intentional. There was no mention of Noah, no acknowledgement of what had happened. No remorse, just the same excuses, the same tired script I had heard my entire life. I didn't respond. I thought that would be enough. Then the email started. Long, rambling messages from Jennifer herself, thinly veiled under the guise of clarification. She wasn't apologizing. Jennifer had never apologized in her life. Instead, She was rewriting the events of the wedding, painting herself as the victim, as the misunderstood matriarch of a family that simply didn't appreciate her sacrifices. According to her, Noah had been disruptive, had inserted himself where he wasn't wanted, had embarrassed her in front of her guests. I felt something cold settle inside me as I read her words. This was familiar. This was what she had always done, twisting reality, shifting blame, making it seem as though the fault had never been hers. She had done it to me when I was a teenager, convincing my father that I was the problem, that I was too sensitive, too dramatic. And now, she was doing it to my son. This time, I would not let it happen. I blocked her email without responding. For a few days, things were quiet. My father must have finally understood that I wasn't going to engage, that his pleas would fall on deaf ears. Rachel and I focused on Noah, making sure he knew none of this was his fault, wrapping him in the warmth of a home that was nothing like the one I had grown up in. But then, something happened that I never could have expected. A letter arrived. At first, I assumed it was another attempt from my father, but the handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar. It was only when I tore it open that I realized the sender wasn't my father. It was from my stepsister. She had never been a major part of my life. She had been Jennifer's daughter, raised under the same roof but in a different world entirely. Jennifer had adored her, had lavished her with attention and praise, the exact opposite of how she had treated me. We had never been close, and as adults we had barely spoken. Yet here she was reaching out. The letter was brief, but what it contained changed everything. She wrote about the wedding, about how she had seen what had happened with Noah, how she had watched Jennifer humiliate him the way she had humiliated me so many times before. But there was more. She wrote about why Jennifer had always resented me. For years, I had assumed Jennifer simply didn't like me, that she had seen me as an unwanted obstacle in her new marriage. But my stepsister revealed something I had never known. Jennifer had always felt threatened by me, not because of anything I had done, but because of what I represented. My father's love for my mother had never faded, not entirely. Even after her death, even after he had married Jennifer, there had always been a part of him that remained devoted to the woman he had lost. And Jennifer had known that. She had seen it in the way he talked about my mother, in the way he treated me as a living reminder of the life he had before her. Jennifer hadn't just resented me. She had hated me. I sat with the letter for a long time, my hands trembling as I processed what I had just read. It didn't change anything. Not the years of cruelty, not the damage she had done, but it made something horrifyingly clear. Jennifer's hatred for me had never been about me. It had been about control. She had wanted to erase my mother from my father's life. And when she couldn't do that, she had tried to erase me instead. And now, she was trying to do the same thing to my son. That realization filled me with a level of rage I had never known before. This wasn't just about the wedding. This wasn't just about my father's failure to defend me. This was a pattern, one that had been set in motion decades ago, one that I had unknowingly allowed to continue by keeping my father in my life for so long. This was never going to stop, not unless I ended it. For the first time in my life, I understood exactly what I needed to do. I wasn't just going no contact. I was going to make sure they could never reach us again. Jennifer had spent years manipulating my father, rewriting history, controlling the narrative. But she would not rewrite Noah's life the way she had tried to rewrite mine. I took the letter, placed it in a drawer, and made my decision. Jennifer had always underestimated me. She had assumed I would always come back, that I would always tolerate her presence, that I would always be my father's backup plan. She was wrong. This was the last time she would ever have the power to hurt my family. But before I could take the final step, before I could sever the last ties for good, I needed to do something I had never done before. I needed to confront my father. And this time, I would be the one to walk away. There are moments in life when clarity doesn't come as an epiphany, but as something quieter. A gradual unraveling of all the lies you've told yourself, the excuses you've made, the desperate hope that things will somehow fix themselves. I had spent years convincing myself that my father could change. That deep down, buried beneath his passivity, there was still a man who cared enough to fight for me. But standing in front of his house that morning, I knew the truth. I wasn't here for him. I was here for me. The house looked the same as it always had. The neatly trimmed hedges, the carefully maintained front porch. On the surface, nothing had changed. But now, looking at it through different eyes, I saw it for what it truly was. This was a place where I had spent years trying to earn a love that should have been unconditional. A house where my voice had never mattered, where Jennifer had rewritten history in her favor, and my father had let her. I had told myself that I needed to have this conversation, that before I walked away forever, I needed to say the words out loud, to make him understand. But as I raised my hand to knock, a thought crept into my mind, one I had been too afraid to fully consider. What if he already understood? What if he had always understood and simply didn't care? The door opened before I had time to dwell on it. My father stood there, his expression unreadable, his mouth slightly open as if he had been expecting me. He stepped aside silently, allowing me to enter, and as I crossed the threshold, I realized something else. Jennifer wasn't here. This was intentional. He had been waiting for this moment. The house was as pristine as ever. Nothing out of place, nothing disturbed. I wondered briefly how much of that was Jennifer's doing. How much of my father's life was still dictated by her rules, her standards. Even now, even with decades behind us, it was impossible to separate where her control ended and his choices began. I sat down, but my father remained standing. He looked uncertain, as if he wasn't sure what I had come to say, though we both knew there was only one thing this could be about. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, years of unspoken words pressing down on us like a physical weight. For most of my life, I had been the one to fill the silence. I had been the one to reach out, to try to mend what had never truly been whole. But I was done with that now. This time, I let him be the first to speak. His voice was quiet, measured. He told me that he didn't want things to end this way. That family was complicated, that mistakes had been made, but that love should be enough to overcome them. Love. The word felt foreign coming from him. For so long, I had mistaken his silence for love. I had told myself that his refusal to stand up for me wasn't a lack of care, but a weakness he simply couldn't overcome. But looking at him now, standing in front of me with that same tired expression, I understood something I had refused to see before. Silence isn't love. Love is action. Love is showing up, protecting, making hard choices. Love is not standing by while your wife systematically destroys your child's sense of worth. Love is not asking for forgiveness without change. I told him I was done. I told him that I had spent my entire life forgiving him, waiting for him to put me first. That I had tolerated Jennifer's cruelty because I had been desperate to keep some version of him in my life. But that time was over. I told him about Noah, about the way he had been treated, about the moment he had realized that his own grandfather had stood by and done nothing. I told him that this was his legacy. And then I told him that he would never see us again. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Not anger, not sadness. Fear. Not fear of losing me. Fear of being alone. He had built his entire life around Jennifer. Every decision, every compromise, every sacrifice had been for her. And now I was finally forcing him to face the cost of that decision. He tried weakly to shift the blame. He told me that Jennifer hadn't meant to hurt Noah, that she had just been overwhelmed, that I was overreacting. The words hit me like a final blow. Overreacting. That had been the word he had used when I was a teenager, when I had first tried to tell him how she made me feel. It was the word he had thrown at me every time I had stood up for myself, every time I had begged him to see what was happening. And now, after everything, he was still saying it. Nothing had changed. Nothing would ever change. The weight that I had carried for so long, the guilt, the second-guessing, the desperate need for his approval was gone. It had taken me 36 years, but I finally understood. This wasn't my burden to carry anymore. I stood up. I didn't say another word. There was nothing left to say. My father watched as I walked to the door. He didn't stop me. He didn't call out. He just stood there, frozen, as I left for the last time. I stepped outside, the morning air crisp against my skin, and for the first time in years, I felt free. There was no regret, no lingering doubt. just the knowledge that I had done what was necessary. When I got home, Rachel was waiting. She didn't ask what had happened. She already knew. She just pulled me into her arms, holding me in a way that told me, without words, that I had made the right choice. That night, as I tucked Noah into bed, he looked up at me with wide, trusting eyes and asked if we were going to see Grandpa again. There was no fear in his voice, no sadness, just curiosity. I told him no, and as I turned off the light and watched him drift off to sleep, I realized that this was what healing looked like. Not a grand moment of reconciliation, not a dramatic confrontation that ended in some kind of cinematic closure. Just this, choosing to protect my son the way I had never been protected. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for my father's approval. I was looking ahead, but Jennifer wasn't done yet. 3 days later, a letter arrived, and inside was something that changed everything. For 3 days after I walked away from my father, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. The decision to go no contact had lifted a weight I hadn't even realized I had been carrying. There were no more second-guessing, no more mental gymnastics to justify my father's actions. I had finally chosen to put my family first. But Jennifer wasn't done. On the third day, the letter arrived. It was waiting for me in the mailbox. An unassuming white envelope with my name written in sharp, deliberate handwriting I recognized immediately. Jennifer. For a long time, I just stared at it, debating whether I should even open it. A part of me wanted to throw it away without a second glance. Another part of me knew that whatever was inside, it would be her final move, a desperate attempt to regain control. I took the envelope inside and sat at the kitchen table, the weight of it pressing against my palm. Rachel stood nearby, silent, watching. She didn't tell me what to do. She trusted me to make the decision. I opened it. Inside was a single-page letter, neatly typed, with a tone so falsely polite that I could practically hear Jennifer's voice dripping with manufactured civility. She began by thanking me for attending the wedding, as if the entire thing had been nothing more than an ordinary family gathering. There was no mention of Noah, no acknowledgement of what had happened that night. Instead, she wrote about how much pain my absence had caused my father, how he was devastated, struggling to understand why I had chosen to sever ties over a misunderstanding. It was classic Jennifer, gaslighting disguised as concern. Then I reached the second half of the letter, and that was when I felt the blood drain from my face. Jennifer wasn't just trying to manipulate me back into the family. She was threatening me. Buried beneath flowery language and passive-aggressive jabs was a very clear message. She and my father had legal rights as grandparents, and if I refused to allow them access to Noah, they would pursue legal action to force visitation. I stared at the words, my mind struggling to process them. She wasn't just trying to claw her way back into my life. She was trying to take my son. A slow, cold rage settled into my bones. Jennifer had spent years trying to control me, and when she couldn't, she had turned her sights on Noah. And my father, spineless, weak, incapable of defying her, had let it happen. I clenched the letter in my fists, my pulse hammering in my ears. Rachel reached out, taking the letter from my hands, her expression unreadable as she scanned the words. When she looked back at me, there was no fear in her eyes, only fury. She knew what I knew. This wasn't just about Jennifer wanting access to Noah. This was about power, about punishing me for finally walking away. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. For years, Jennifer had relied on my silence. She had operated under the assumption that I would never fight back, that I would always bend, always yield. But she had made one critical mistake. I wasn't the same scared kid she had manipulated. I had spent my life trying to please my father, trying to find a way to exist within a family that had never truly wanted me. But Noah? He was wanted. He was loved, protected, cherished. And I would burn the world down before I let Jennifer get anywhere near him. That night, I gathered every piece of evidence I had ever kept. Emails, texts, messages from my stepsister detailing the way Jennifer had treated me as a child. I made copies, backed up everything, documented every interaction. I spoke with a lawyer the next morning. Jennifer might have thought she was playing a game, but I was about to end it. The lawyer was blunt, Grandparent rights varied by state, but they were far from guaranteed. Courts prioritized the parent's decision, especially if there was a documented history of emotional abuse. Jennifer had no case, but the fact that she was willing to threaten legal action was enough for me to take this to the next level. I wrote my own letter. Unlike Jennifer's, mine was not polite. I informed her, in no uncertain terms, that any further attempts to contact me, Rachel, or Noah would be considered harassment and met with legal action. I made it clear that I had documented everything, every manipulation, every incident of mistreatment, every witness willing to testify on my behalf. And then I ended it with one final truth. She had already lost, because no court, no judge, no force on this earth could make Noah love her. And that was the real reason Jennifer had written the letter. Not because she truly wanted a relationship with Noah, but because she had finally realized she had no power left. I mailed the letter the next morning, and I never heard from Jennifer again. My father never reached out after that either. Whether it was shame, resignation, or simply obedience to Jennifer's will, I would never know. But I didn't care, because I had already won. Not in a petty way, not in the way Jennifer would have seen it. I won because when I looked at my son, I saw freedom. Noah would never grow up feeling like he had to earn love. He would never doubt his worth, never feel the sting of silent rejection. He would never know what it was like to look at a parent and wonder why wasn't I enough. Because I had chosen to end the cycle. I had spent my entire life waiting for my father to choose me. In the end, I chose myself. And that was the best decision I had ever made. Some people spend years trapped in the illusion that family is sacred, that no matter how much damage they cause, no matter how much they hurt you, they deserve a place in your life simply because of blood. But family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is walk away. For good.